When we think about the past, we often imagine it as a time of constant struggle. Hunger, war, disease, and survival at every turn. We picture humans exhausted, fighting nature, barely holding on. And in many eras, that image is true. But history has another side. There were moments when life became stable, when food was available, when wars paused, when cities prospered, when people for the first time in a long while had something unfamiliar: free time. And this is where history becomes truly strange, because when humans are no longer consumed by survival, they do not always become wiser. They do not always become kinder. Sometimes they become curious in unsettling ways. Sometimes they invent games, rituals, and trends that seem so bizarre, so unnecessary that modern minds struggle to understand them. These were not accidents. They were not isolated incidents. They were trends, behaviors copied, repeated, admired, and spread across societies simply because people had the time, the resources, and the psychological space to explore ideas that would never emerge in moments of desperation. Ron Roy, as we might call it today, is often seen as harmless, even positive, a sign of progress. But history tells us that idle time can be dangerous. Not because humans are evil, but because humans are restless. When basic needs are met, the mind searches for stimulation, for meaning, for excitement. And if meaning is not readily available, it will be invented, sometimes in beautiful ways, sometimes in deeply disturbing ones. Throughout history, entire societies embraced trends that served no practical purpose, activities that endangered life, rituals that inflicted pain, fashions that damaged bodies. Entertainment that revolved around suffering, beliefs that encouraged people to cross boundaries they might otherwise never approach. And the most unsettling part is this: most participants did not feel strange doing it. They felt normal, they felt included, they felt like everyone else. That is what makes trends powerful. They do not ask for reflection, they reward imitation. They turn individual discomfort into collective acceptance. History is full of moments where people did not ask, "Is this right?" They asked, "Why isn't everyone doing this?" In those moments, reason takes a back seat to belonging. We often assume that bizarre behavior in history must have come from ignorance or desperation. But many of the strangest trends emerged not from poverty, but from abundance. Not from chaos, but from stability. When societies had time to spare, they experimented. With bodies, with beliefs, with danger, with death. And these experiments did not stay small. They spread through cities, classes, and even continents. People joined in because it was fashionable, because it was admired, because it was talked about, because doing nothing felt worse. These trends reveal something uncomfortable about human nature, that boredom is not empty. It is active. It pushes people toward extremes. It tempts them to feel something, anything, even if that feeling is fear, pain, or shock. History shows us that humans do not need hardship to create suffering. Sometimes they create it themselves. As you listen to the stories ahead, you may feel disbelief. You may laugh nervously. You may ask how anyone could have thought these behaviors were a good idea. But the answer is rarely simple. These people were not irrational. They were responding to social pressure, curiosity, fear of exclusion, and the powerful pull of collective behavior. When everyone around you participates, resistance feels unnatural. And when a trend promises excitement, identity, or meaning, logic often loses its voice. This is not a problem unique to the past. The forms have changed. The mechanisms have not. Humans still follow trends that harm them. They still participate in challenges that risk safety. They still glorify behaviors that make little sense in hindsight. They still mistake attention for value and participation for purpose. The difference is that history gives us distance. Distance allows us to see patterns clearly. And those patterns repeat. The stories you are about to hear are not legends. They are not exaggerations designed to shock. They are documented moments when entire groups of people collectively agreed that something strange, dangerous, or pointless was worth doing. Sometimes for fun, sometimes for status, sometimes for belief, sometimes simply because everyone else was doing it. Each story reveals a different face of human idleness, not laziness but restless energy searching for direction. And when direction is missing, curiosity fills the void. These trends may feel absurd, but they are also deeply human. They show us how easily behavior spreads, how quickly norms shift, how fragile the idea of common sense really is. As we begin with the first story, keep one thought in mind. The people you're about to hear about were not fundamentally different from you. They laughed. They feared judgment. They wanted to belong. They wanted to feel alive. The only difference is the world they lived in. And if you had been born into that world surrounded by the same voices, the same expectations, the same boredom, the same excitement, there is a strong chance you would have joined them. Because history suggests that when humans have too much time, they do not always create progress. Sometimes they create something far stranger. And once it becomes a trend, stopping feels almost impossible. Let us begin. Story 1. When watching others die became entertainment. There was a time in human history when boredom was not solved by screens, stories, or imagination. When people did not escape reality to be entertained. Instead, they gathered to watch reality itself become brutal, bloody, and final. They gathered to watch others die. In ancient Rome, the arena was not merely a place of combat, it was the beating heart of public life. A space where citizens came together not just to be distracted, but to feel something intense, something undeniable, something alive. Gladiatorial games were advertised, celebrated, and anticipated with excitement that rivals modern sports events. People planned their days around them. They traveled long distances. They brought food, family members, and children. This was not hidden violence. It was communal entertainment. Men were trained to fight, not always to the death, but often enough that mortality was expected. Blood soaked into the sand, bodies collapsed under the sun, and the crowd reacted not with horror but with emotion. Cheers, disappointment, approval, disapproval. Death was interactive. The audience had power. A gesture, a shout, a collective reaction could decide whether a fallen man lived or died. This participation blurred the boundary between observer and executioner. Watching suffering became a way to feel involved. For many Romans, these games were not seen as cruel. They were seen as moral lessons, displays of courage, proof of discipline, a reminder of power and order. Life was cheap, but honor mattered. And yet, beneath these justifications was something simpler. People were entertained. The games satisfied curiosity about pain, about endurance, about the limits of the human body. They allowed spectators to confront death without facing it themselves. Fear was outsourced, but Rome was not alone. Centuries later, across medieval Europe, public executions served a similar purpose. When someone was sentenced to death, the event was announced publicly. Town squares filled, vendors sold food, children were lifted onto shoulders so they could see better. Executions were slow by design, hanging, burning, breaking on the wheel, drawing and quartering. These punishments were not intended to be efficient. They were intended to be seen, to be remembered. Pain was part of the message, but over time the message became secondary. What remained was spectacle. People discussed executions beforehand. They argued about methods. They criticized executioners when deaths were too quick or too messy. Sympathy existed, but it was fleeting. The condemned were transformed into objects. This transformation made it easier to watch. To normalize suffering, humanity learned to dehumanize selectively. Criminals, traitors, heretics, and outsiders were stripped of individuality. Their pain became acceptable because they were no longer seen as fully human. This mental shift allowed entire communities to participate without guilt. What makes this trend especially unsettling is that it thrived not during times of chaos, but during periods of relative stability, when food was available, when cities functioned, when daily survival was not immediately threatened. People came because they had time, because life had space for entertainment. And in the absence of healthier outlets, violence filled that space. Children growing up in these societies did not recoil at the sight of death. They were introduced to it early. Public punishment became a lesson in obedience, a demonstration of consequences. Over time, sensitivity dulled. When something is repeated often enough, it loses its shock. Executions became routine. Crowds expected them. Attendance was normal, and because it was normal, it was rarely questioned. This is how a trend becomes entrenched, not through cruelty but through repetition. The psychological distance between viewer and victim grew. People learned to watch without feeling, to judge without empathy, to enjoy without reflection. This emotional training had consequences. A society accustomed to watching suffering becomes efficient at inflicting it. Violence stops feeling extraordinary. It becomes a tool. Even when executions moved indoors, the desire to watch did not disappear. It simply changed form. Public dissections, punishments, later printed illustrations and stories. Violence adapted to new mediums. The trend evolved. History shows us that humans are drawn to extremes when seeking stimulation. When life becomes predictable, danger becomes fascinating. When safety is stable, risk becomes entertainment. Watching others die allowed people to feel intense emotion without personal danger. It created adrenaline without consequence, power without responsibility. And once that emotional reward was discovered, it spread. Not everyone enjoyed it. There were critics, philosophers, religious figures who questioned the morality. But trends do not survive on logic. They survive on participation. Those who objected were often drowned out by the crowd. Over time, executions became less public, not because people suddenly became more compassionate, but because governments realized spectacle could backfire. Crowds could sympathize. Executions could become chaotic. Control could be lost. Violence was hidden for political reasons, not moral awakening. But the human appetite for spectacle never vanished. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Entertainment does not have to be kind. When given the opportunity, humans have repeatedly chosen stimulation over empathy, curiosity over compassion, participation over reflection, and boredom plays a critical role. When people are busy surviving, they have little energy for cruelty. When they have time, curiosity grows, and curiosity unchecked can wander into dark places. The people who attended these events were not monsters. They were citizens, families, neighbors. They laughed. They feared boredom. They sought meaning in shared experiences. They were human. And that is what makes this trend so disturbing. It reveals that under the right conditions, ordinary people can normalize extraordinary cruelty. Not because they desire harm, but because harm becomes entertaining. As we move forward, the next story will show us a different side of this same impulse. A trend that emerged not from watching death, but from displaying danger in daily life. Because when humans had time and resources, they did not just watch strange things. They collected them. They lived with them. And they turned risk into Story 2. When keeping dangerous creatures became a trend. There was a time when status was not displayed through wealth alone, not through clothing, jewelry, or architecture. It was displayed through danger. To own something rare was impressive. To own something beautiful was admirable. But to live alongside something that could kill you, that was power. Throughout history, particularly during periods of peace and prosperity, humans developed a strange fascination with keeping dangerous creatures close, not for survival, not for labor, but for prestige, curiosity, and entertainment. Wild animals were brought into homes, courts, and private collections. Lions, bears, wolves, venomous snakes, and exotic beasts were treated as living symbols of dominance over nature. This was not accidental. It was fashionable. In ancient Rome, wealthy elites kept menageries filled with animals captured from distant lands. These creatures were displayed to guests as proof of influence and reach. Owning a beast from across the empire meant you had resources, connections, and authority. The animal's danger was part of its value. The greater the risk, the greater the admiration. Later, during medieval and early modern periods, European nobility continued this trend. Kings and aristocrats housed wild animals in castles and estates. Bears chained in courtyards. Big cats caged behind iron bars, exotic birds roaming halls. These were not zoos in the modern sense. They were statements. Visitors were expected to feel awe. Fear was not a flaw, it was the point. Even common people were drawn to this fascination. Traveling animal exhibitions attracted crowds. Dangerous creatures were brought into towns, paraded, poked, and stared at. Children gathered close. Adults challenged their courage by standing near cages. The presence of danger turned observation into thrill. But the trend did not stop with animals. Humans themselves became part of the spectacle. People displayed deformities, illnesses, and physical extremes as curiosities. The unusual became entertainment. The dangerous became desirable. Living with risk became a way to escape boredom. For those with time and means, danger filled the void left by monotony. When daily survival no longer demanded attention, curiosity searched for intensity elsewhere, and intensity was found in proximity to harm. What makes this trend unsettling is how casually danger was accepted. Injuries were common. Deaths occurred. Animals attacked handlers, guests, and sometimes owners themselves. These incidents did not end the trend, they fueled it. Stories of close calls circulated. Survivors gained reputation. Risk-enhanced narrative. The danger itself became part of social identity. To say I survived was to say, I am important. This mindset reveals something deeply human. Risk is exciting when it is voluntary. When danger feels chosen rather than imposed, it transforms fear into thrill. People participating in these trends were not unaware of the danger. They embraced it. They believed control, skill, or status would protect them. And sometimes it did, but often it did not. Animals do not recognize human ego. They respond to instinct. No amount of prestige can negotiate with hunger or fear. When attacks occurred, explanations were found. The handler was careless. The animal was provoked. Fate intervened. Rarely did people question the trend itself, because questioning it meant questioning identity. This fascination with danger extended beyond animals. Dangerous chemicals, experimental substances, and hazardous objects were collected and displayed. Curiosity cabinets featured items meant to shock and disturb. The stranger the object, the more valuable it felt. Boredom drove exploration into risky territory, and society rewarded it. Those who dared were admired. Those who refused were dull. This social pressure reinforced participation. Even those who felt fear joined in, not wanting to appear weak or out of touch. Children raised in these environments learned early that danger was normal, that proximity to harm was impressive, that fear could be suppressed for approval. This normalization had consequences. As generations grew accustomed to risk, boundaries blurred. What was once thrilling became ordinary. People sought greater danger to achieve the same stimulation. This escalation is a pattern seen repeatedly in history. When excitement fades, intensity must increase. The trend of keeping dangerous creatures eventually declined, not because of moral awakening, but because of regulation, cost, and changing values. Urbanization made such practices impractical. Public safety became a concern. Risk shifted from prestige to liability. But the impulse did not disappear. It transformed. Today, humans still seek controlled danger. Extreme sports, risky challenges, thrill-seeking behavior shared publicly for admiration. The medium has changed, but the motivation remains. History reminds us that danger has always been attractive to bored minds. When life feels predictable, risk feels meaningful. This story is not about cruelty to animals alone. It is about how humans use danger to fill psychological space, how boredom can distort values, how risk becomes currency in social systems. The people who kept these creatures were not villains. They were searching for stimulation. And in that search, they learned to live beside danger without fully respecting it. As we move to the next story, we will see this same pattern take a darker turn inward. A trend where danger was no longer external, no longer kept in cages. It was applied to the human body itself. Because when risk becomes familiar, humans eventually stop looking outward. They start experimenting on themselves. Story 3. When self-inflicted suffering became fashionable. There is a quiet assumption in modern thinking that pain is something to avoid, that suffering is a signal to stop, that the human body, when hurt, demands protection. This belief feels instinctive, almost biological. But history reveals a period when the opposite was true. There were times when pain was admired, when suffering was fashionable, when deliberately hurting oneself was not a sign of desperation, but of virtue, discipline, and even social status. Across different cultures and centuries, people willingly subjected their own bodies to extreme discomfort, injury, and deprivation, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. And more unsettling still, they were praised for it. In religious communities, self-inflicted suffering was often framed as purity. The body was seen as a source of temptation, weakness, and corruption. Pain was believed to cleanse it, to control it, to elevate the soul above flesh. People whipped themselves publicly. They fasted until their bodies weakened. They slept on cold stone floors. They pierced their skin. They wore garments designed to cause constant discomfort. Some carried chains beneath their clothing, letting the metal bite into skin with every movement. These practices were not hidden. They were performed openly. Crowds gathered to witness devotion expressed through pain. The more extreme the suffering, the stronger the admiration. Endurance became proof of moral superiority. Scars became symbols of faith. Pain was transformed into identity. But religion was not the only force behind this trend. In many societies, discipline itself became fashionable. Endurance was equated with strength of character. To deny comfort was to prove control. To suffer willingly was to demonstrate mastery over desire. As daily life became easier for certain classes, suffering became a way to feel significant. When hunger no longer threatened survival, pain was repurposed as meaning. This is a pattern history repeats. When basic needs are met, humans seek transcendence. And when transcendence feels unreachable, suffering fills the gap. People learn to associate discomfort with virtue. To embrace pain, not as a warning, but as validation. Children were raised within these systems. They watched adults praise endurance. They learned early that comfort was suspicious, that pleasure was dangerous, that pain made you worthy. This mindset reshaped entire cultures. Self-denial became contagious. Those who did not participate were judged as weak, indulgent, or morally inferior. Participation became social pressure. To refuse was to stand out, and standing out was dangerous. As with all trends, escalation followed. What once seemed extreme became normal. People pushed boundaries further to maintain distinction. Longer fasts, harsher punishments, more visible suffering. The body became a canvas for belief. What makes this trend especially unsettling is how voluntary it was. These individuals were not imprisoned. They were not coerced. They chose pain because it promised identity, respect, and belonging. Pain was no longer something that happened to you. It was something you did to yourself. This voluntary suffering created a powerful illusion of control in a world full of uncertainty. Disease, death, instability, choosing pain gave people agency. They could not control fate, but they could control their own bodies. This illusion was comforting, but it was also destructive. Many suffered long-term injuries. Some died. Infections spread, bodies weakened, minds broke under sustained deprivation. But these outcomes were reframed as sacrifices rather than failures. If someone died, they were honored. If someone suffered, they were celebrated. The system reinforced itself. Even outside religious contexts, similar behaviors appeared. Extreme physical challenges, public endurance displays, dangerous feats performed for admiration. Pain as entertainment, pain as proof. The line between devotion and obsession blurred. This trend reveals something deeply uncomfortable about human psychology. Pain, when given meaning, becomes tolerable. When suffering is framed as purpose, humans can endure almost anything. This does not make them irrational. It makes them adaptable. But adaptability has a cost. When pain is normalized, compassion weakens. When suffering is praised, empathy fades. When harm is voluntary, concern feels unnecessary. This shift affected how societies treated others as well. If pain was good for the self, it could be justified for others. Discipline hardened, punishments intensified, cruelty gained moral framing. The belief that suffering strengthens does not stay contained. It spreads. Over time, many of these practices faded, not because they were exposed as harmful, but because cultural values shifted. Comfort became acceptable. The body gained value beyond endurance. Health became desirable, but echoes remain. Even today, suffering is sometimes romanticized. Hardship is praised. Burnout is admired. Pain is reframed as growth. The language has changed, but the pattern persists. History shows us that boredom and stability can push humans toward extremes, not outward but inward. When danger is no longer external, it becomes internalized. People begin testing their limits, not to survive, but to feel alive. As we move into the next story, this pattern of self-directed experimentation will take an even darker turn. A turn where curiosity, not belief, becomes the driving force. Where the body is no longer disciplined for virtue, but treated as a testing ground. Because when humans had time, they did not stop at enduring pain. They began experimenting with it. And sometimes they did not survive the experiment. Story 4. When the human body became an experiment. There is a comforting belief in the modern world that experimentation belongs in laboratories. That tests are conducted by trained professionals under controlled conditions, guided by ethics and safety. We like to think that curiosity has rules now. For most of history, it did not. When humans had time, resources, and curiosity but lacked understanding. They turned their own bodies into testing grounds, not out of desperation but fascination. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to see what would happen. The human body became an experiment. Across centuries, people willingly consumed strange substances, applied dangerous compounds to their skin, inhaled toxic vapors, and subjected themselves to unknown effects. All in the name of discovery, fashion, or belief. There were no clinical trials, no warnings, no regulations, only curiosity. In periods of relative peace and prosperity, experimentation flourished. When survival was no longer the dominant concern, attention shifted inward. People wanted to improve themselves, alter their bodies, or unlock hidden potential. And without scientific frameworks, experimentation became reckless. Alchemy promised transformation, elixirs promised vitality, tonics promised intelligence, strength, or eternal youth. These promises were rarely questioned. If something was rare, exotic, or mysterious, it felt powerful. People drank mercury. They swallowed arsenic in small doses. They rubbed lead-based compounds into their skin. They inhaled fumes produced by heated metals. These substances were not labeled as dangerous. They were labeled as intriguing. Some believed poison could build immunity. Others believed that the body, when challenged, became stronger. A little danger was seen as beneficial. Discomfort was interpreted as evidence that something was happening. If there was pain, the experiment was working. This belief encouraged escalation. People increased dosages, combined substances, tested new mixtures on themselves and others. Failures were dismissed as individual weakness rather than flawed ideas. Death, when it occurred, was attributed to fate. Survivors became proof. This selective memory reinforced the trend. Stories of those who endured circulated widely. Stories of those who died quietly faded away. The body became a canvas for experimentation not only in chemistry, but in physical modification. Extreme piercings, scarification. Body alterations designed to test endurance or aesthetics. Pain was embraced as part of the process. The absence of oversight made everything possible. Curiosity cabinets displayed strange substances, preserved organs, and experimental tools. Visitors admired not only the objects, but the willingness to experiment, to risk. Risk became a marker of intellect and boldness. Children grew up surrounded by this mindset. They watched adults test boundaries. They learned that danger was educational, that pushing limits was admirable. This normalized risk-taking. Even medical experimentation followed similar patterns. Physicians tested treatments directly on patients without consent. Doses were guessed. Procedures were improvised. Successes were celebrated. Failures were forgotten. The idea that experimentation required caution had not yet formed. Progress demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice was often human. What makes this trend especially unsettling is that it thrived during moments of optimism, when people believed they were on the verge of unlocking secrets of nature, when curiosity felt heroic. The body was not protected, it was expendable. This willingness to experiment without restraint reveals something essential about human psychology. Curiosity is not neutral. When combined with boredom and ambition, it can become dangerous. Humans are not satisfied with stability. They want novelty, and novelty, when unchecked, often leads toward harm. Over time, the accumulation of injuries, illnesses, and unexplained deaths forced change. Patterns emerged. Certain substances always harmed. Certain experiments never worked. Slowly, painfully, knowledge formed. But knowledge came at a cost. Generations suffered so future ones could learn. This story reminds us that scientific caution is not natural. It is learned. It emerges from failure, tragedy, and reflection. Without boundaries, curiosity does not self-regulate. It escalates. Even today, echoes remain. Experimental trends resurface in new forms. Unregulated supplements, extreme self-optimization, dangerous challenges framed as improvement. The belief that the body is something to test rather than protect persists. History teaches us that when humans have time and resources, curiosity will always push limits. The question is not whether people will experiment, it is whether they will survive the experiment. As we move forward, the next story will show us how experimentation turned outward again, away from substances and internal tests and toward appearances, toward beauty. Because when humans had time, they did not only experiment with health, they experimented with how they looked. And sometimes the pursuit of beauty became just as dangerous as any poison. Story 5. When beauty became more important than survival. There is a quiet assumption in the modern world that beauty should never come at the cost of health. That pain, damage, or death in the pursuit of appearance is irrational, extreme, and avoidable. We like to believe that no one would willingly risk their life simply to look a certain way. History disagrees. Again and again, when societies reached moments of stability and abundance, beauty transformed from expression into obsession. Appearance became currency, fashion became identity, and the human body became something to reshape, constrain, and sacrifice. Danger was not a side effect, it was part of the trend. Across centuries, people altered their bodies in ways that caused permanent damage, chronic pain, and sometimes death, all in the name of elegance, status, and belonging. These practices were not fringe behaviors. They were admired, imitated, and enforced socially. To refuse was to be excluded. One of the most striking examples lies in the long history of body compression. Corsets, bindings, and restrictive garments reshaped bodies into unnatural forms. Rib cages were compressed, organs were displaced, breathing became shallow and difficult, fainting was common. This was not seen as a problem, it was seen as refinement. A body that struggled to function was proof that its owner did not need to labor. Fragility became a sign of class, strength looked common, weakness looked elegant. Women learned to endure constant discomfort. Internal pain was normalized, long-term damage was ignored. Doctors warned of risks, but fashion spoke louder. The body adapted and adaptation was praised. Elsewhere, beauty demanded toxins. Cosmetics contained lead, mercury, and arsenic. Skin was whitened at the cost of poisoning. Hair was dyed with corrosive substances. Eyes were enhanced with chemicals that damaged vision. These products burned, they blistered, they sickened, but they worked, at least visually. Illness followed slowly, hair fell out, teeth loosened, skin deteriorated. Symptoms were blamed on age or fate. Rarely was beauty itself questioned. If many people suffered, suffering became normal. In some cultures, beauty demanded deformation. Feet were bound until bones broke and reshaped. Necks were elongated through pressure. Heads were bound in infancy to achieve ideal shapes. These practices caused lifelong pain and disability. They were performed on children. Because beauty standards do not wait for consent, parents enforced these traditions out of love, belief, and fear. A child who did not conform would struggle socially. Marriage prospects would suffer. Status would be lost. Pain was justified as preparation for life. This is what makes the trend so chilling. Beauty was not personal. It was collective. And when beauty becomes collective, it becomes compulsory. People did not choose these practices freely. They were born into systems where participation was expected. To resist was to risk isolation. To comply was to survive socially. The danger was not just physical. It was psychological. The body became a problem to solve. Something never quite right, something that needed correction. This mindset reshaped identity. People learned to view discomfort as investment, pain as progress, damage as necessary. As with all trends, escalation followed. When one look became common, extremes were needed to stand out. Tighter compression, whiter skin, more dramatic alteration, fashion chased novelty, the body paid the price. Men were not exempt. Hairstyles, facial treatments, and grooming rituals involved sharp tools, toxic substances, and painful procedures. Status demanded appearance. The idea that beauty should be effortless is a modern illusion. In the past, it was work, dangerous work, and society rewarded those who endured it. What makes this story particularly unsettling is how slowly these practices faded. Even as evidence of harm accumulated, trends persisted. Beauty standards are emotional, not rational. They tap into fear of exclusion and desire for approval. Logic rarely wins. Only when economic, social, or cultural shifts occurred did styles change. Not because people suddenly valued health more, but because new ideals replaced old ones. The suffering simply changed form. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When humans have time, resources, and social pressure, they will harm themselves to belong. They will endure pain to be admired. They will sacrifice health for acceptance, and they will call it choice. History shows us that beauty has often been a quiet battlefield, not fought with weapons, but with bodies. Not enforced by law, but by expectation. The trend of dangerous beauty practices reveals how easily humans internalize external standards, how deeply identity can be tied to appearance, how quickly harm becomes invisible when it is shared. As we move forward, the next story will show us how this fascination with appearance and difference took another dark turn, one that did not stop at altering bodies but displayed them. Because when humans had time, they did not just change how people looked, they turned unusual bodies into entertainment. And the line between curiosity and cruelty disappeared. Story 6. When human difference became public entertainment. There is a modern belief that human dignity is universal, that no matter how different a person looks or lives, they deserve privacy, respect, and protection. We like to think that curiosity stops where cruelty begins. History shows a different pattern. There were long periods when difference itself became a spectacle. When human beings were displayed not for who they were, but for how unusual they appeared, not as individuals, but as attractions, and this was not done in secret. It was done openly, proudly, and for profit. When societies reached moments of stability and leisure, curiosity turned outward. People wanted novelty. They wanted something strange enough to break routine, something shocking enough to feel alive. And human difference became one of the most accessible forms of entertainment. Bodies that deviated from the norm were labeled as curiosities. Physical deformities, illnesses, unusual proportions, and rare conditions were transformed into public displays. People were exhibited in markets, traveling shows, fairs, and private collections. Crowds gathered to stare, they paid to look, they asked questions, they laughed, they speculated, they invented stories. The individuals on display became objects of fascination rather than people. This trend did not emerge from ignorance alone. It was fueled by boredom. When daily life became predictable, difference became exciting. When danger and hardship receded, novelty filled the emotional gap. People justified their curiosity in many ways. Some claimed educational value, others framed it as scientific interest. Many simply admitted it was entertaining. The language used softened the reality. Exhibits were described as wonders, marvels, or natural anomalies. The discomfort of the individual was hidden behind spectacle. Consent was rarely considered. Many of those displayed had no choice. Poverty forced participation. Families sold access to children born with visible conditions. Individuals with illnesses or disabilities were pressured into exhibition because alternatives were limited. Survival depended on being seen. This dependence created a cruel paradox. Visibility brought income, but also stripped dignity. To be accepted, one had to perform their own difference. People learned to exaggerate, to tell stories about themselves that matched expectations, to become characters rather than humans. The audience rarely questioned this arrangement. They saw a ticket. They saw entertainment. They did not see exploitation. Children were brought to these displays. They learned early that difference was something to point at, something to judge, something to consume visually. This education shaped societal attitudes, empathy weakened, fear of difference grew. Curiosity replaced compassion. The displayed individuals became symbols rather than people. Symbols of mystery, symbols of abnormality, symbols of fascination. The trend spread across cultures. In some societies, difference was framed as divine punishment or supernatural sign. In others, it was treated as scientific puzzle. In all cases, the result was the same. Human beings became objects. What makes this trend particularly unsettling is how normalized it was. Advertisements announced exhibitions proudly, newspapers reviewed them, wealthy patrons hosted private viewings. No one whispered. This was mainstream entertainment. The people who attended did not see themselves as cruel. They believed they were participating in culture, in learning, in curiosity. The suffering behind the scenes was invisible. Physical exhaustion, emotional strain, constant scrutiny, loss of privacy, being reduced to a single trait. These costs were rarely acknowledged. When illness worsened or death occurred, the story moved on. Another exhibit replaced the last. Curiosity demanded constant novelty. Difference was consumed and discarded. This pattern reveals something deeply uncomfortable about human psychology. Curiosity, when detached from empathy, becomes predatory. It seeks stimulation, not understanding. And boredom amplifies this impulse. When humans have time, they look for intensity. When intensity is scarce, they manufacture it, and other people become raw material. Over time, resistance grew. Philosophical movements questioned the morality of such displays. Medical understanding reframed difference as condition rather than spectacle. Laws slowly emerged to protect individuals. But these changes came late. Generations lived and died under public scrutiny, their identities shaped by the gaze of strangers. Even today, echoes remain. Media still sensationalizes difference. Illness and trauma are packaged for consumption. The language has changed, but the impulse persists. The trend of turning difference into entertainment reminds us that progress is not only about technology or knowledge. It is about restraint, about recognizing when curiosity crosses into harm. History shows us that humans are capable of great empathy, but also great detachment. When systems reward spectacle, empathy often loses. As we move into the next story, we will see this same impulse take an even more dangerous form. One where curiosity and boredom did not just observe danger but actively sought it. Because when humans had time, they did not stop at watching others live differently. They began playing games with death itself, and they called it fun. Story 7. When playing with death became a game. There is a powerful instinct inside every human to avoid death. It shapes fear, caution, and survival. We are wired to step back from danger, to protect the body, to preserve life. This instinct feels universal, undeniable. And yet, history records moments when people did the opposite, not because they were forced, not because they were desperate, but because they were bored. When societies reached periods of stability, when daily life became predictable, humans began seeking intensity. They searched for experiences that cut through routine, that made them feel alive. And for some, the only thing intense enough was proximity to death, so they turned it into a game. Across different cultures and centuries, people deliberately engaged in activities where the risk of death was not accidental, but central to the experience. These were not acts of war or survival. They were voluntary challenges, dares, and competitions designed to flirt with mortality. The closer to death one came, the more impressive the feat. Young men challenged each other to stand beneath falling objects, to wrestle dangerous animals, to walk across unstable structures, to swim in treacherous waters. The point was not skill alone, but nerve. Fearlessness became status. To hesitate was to lose respect. Crowds gathered to watch. Friends encouraged participants. Stories spread afterward. Survivors were celebrated. Those who failed were mourned briefly, then replaced by the next challenger. The game continued. In some societies, dangerous rituals blurred the line between tradition and thrill. Initiation ceremonies involved physical harm, exposure to danger, or extreme endurance. Survival was proof of worthiness. Injury was acceptable. Death was tragic but not unexpected. What mattered was participation. Children raised in these cultures learned early that risk equaled honor. Safety looked cowardly. Recklessness looked brave. This social framing rewired instinct. Fear became something to suppress. Pain became something to endure. Survival became something to prove. As with all trends, escalation followed. When one challenge became common, it lost its power. New dangers were introduced. Higher risks, greater consequences. The body was pushed further. People began timing how long they could hold their breath, how far they could go without food or water, how much pain they could endure without reacting. These contests were not scientific experiments. They were social performances. Winning meant admiration. Losing meant injury or death. The most unsettling aspect of these games is not the danger itself, but the applause surrounding it. Risk-taking was rewarded socially. Recklessness became admirable. Survival bias distorted memory. Those who lived were remembered. Those who died were forgotten. This selective storytelling made danger seem safer than it was. Survivors became legends. Fatal outcomes became footnotes. The narrative favored thrill over caution. This is how trends become self-sustaining. People saw others survive and assumed they would too. They underestimated risk. They overestimated control, and boredom pushed them forward. These games reveal something uncomfortable about human psychology. When life feels predictable, humans crave unpredictability. When safety feels constant, danger feels meaningful. Death becomes fascinating when it feels distant. The problem is that death does not respect games. In many cases, tragedy struck suddenly. A misstep, a moment of miscalculation. A body pushed just beyond its limit. When death occurred, explanations followed quickly. The person was careless, the conditions were wrong, it was bad luck. Rarely was the game itself questioned, because questioning the game meant questioning the thrill, and thrill was what people came for. Over time, authorities attempted to limit these behaviors. Rules were imposed. Dangerous activities were restricted, but enforcement was inconsistent. Social pressure was stronger than regulation. People continued to play. The echoes of these trends are still visible today. Extreme challenges, viral dares, risky stunts shared for attention. The language has changed, but the impulse remains. Humans still seek validation through danger. Still equate risk with courage, still confuse recklessness with bravery. History reminds us that the desire to feel alive can override the instinct to stay alive. When boredom meets curiosity, and curiosity meets social pressure, death becomes a possibility people are willing to accept, not because they want to die, but because they want to be seen. As we move forward, the next story will show us how this fascination with danger took on a different form, one less physical but equally destructive. Because when humans had time, they did not only play with death, they played with truth. And entire societies were swept up in ideas that felt exciting, convincing, and completely wrong. Story 8. When pseudoscience became a social obsession, there is a comforting belief that humans are naturally rational, that when evidence is available, people will follow it, that false ideas cannot survive long in the face of truth. History quietly dismantles this belief. Again and again, entire societies have embraced ideas that were not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because the ideas felt exciting, reassuring, or fashionable. When people had time, curiosity did not always lead to understanding. Sometimes it led to illusion. Pseudoscience thrived most during periods of stability. When survival no longer demanded constant attention, minds turned toward explanation. People wanted answers. They wanted systems that explained health, personality, fate, and success. And when real science could not yet provide those answers, imitation filled the gap. Ideas dressed in the language of knowledge spread quickly. Charts, diagrams, measurements, and terminology gave authority to speculation. The more complex the system appeared, the more convincing it felt. People wanted to believe. One of the most influential trends was the belief that the human body revealed character and destiny. Skull shapes, facial angles, body proportions, and even posture were analyzed as indicators of intelligence, morality, and criminality. People measured heads, they categorized noses, they traced lines across faces. They believed they were reading truth. These practices were not confined to fringe groups. They were taught in schools, used by doctors, consulted by courts. Parents judged children's futures based on physical traits. This obsession felt scientific. It was anything but, yet it spread because it offered certainty. In a complex world, it simplified humanity into categories: good or bad, smart or foolish, dangerous or safe. Uncertainty disappeared, and people found comfort in that. Another wave of pseudoscience focused on invisible forces. Energy fields, magnetic influences, mysterious fluids believed to flow through the body. Treatments promised balance, alignment, and harmony. Devices were invented. Therapies were sold. Rituals were performed. People felt something. And feeling became evidence. Placebo effects reinforced belief. Temporary relief was interpreted as proof. Failures were blamed on improper use, not flawed ideas. The system protected itself. What makes these trends so unsettling is how eagerly they were embraced by educated classes. Intellectuals debated them. Scholars refined them. Institutions legitimized them. Curiosity transformed into obsession. When societies have time, they do not always question ideas more carefully. Sometimes they spread them more enthusiastically. Belief became a social activity. Dinner conversations revolved around theories. Trends influenced fashion, behavior, and relationships. People made life decisions based on unproven ideas: marriage, prospects, career choices, medical treatments. Lives were shaped by illusion. Children grew up internalizing these systems. They learned to judge themselves and others according to pseudo-scientific rules. A child labeled deficient might never escape that label. A person deemed superior might never question it. These ideas justified inequality. They explained suffering. They excused cruelty. If someone failed, the system said it was natural. If someone suffered, it was destiny. Responsibility disappeared into theory. This is how dangerous ideas gain power. They absolve, they simplify, they comfort, and boredom fuels them. When people have time, they think. When they think without tools for critical evaluation, imagination can masquerade as truth. The collapse of these trends did not happen quickly. Evidence accumulated slowly. Contradictions emerged. But belief systems do not collapse under pressure. They erode. Even when discredited, remnants remained. Language persisted, assumptions lingered, cultural habits outlived scientific correction, and new pseudosciences replaced old ones. History shows us that humans are not drawn to truth alone. They are drawn to meaning, to stories that explain the world in ways that feel satisfying. And when those stories come with charts, authority, and social approval, they become irresistible. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Intelligence does not protect against false belief. Education does not guarantee skepticism. Leisure does not produce wisdom. Sometimes it produces fixation. The past reminds us that ideas can be dangerous even when they sound reasonable. That trends can distort understanding without appearing absurd. That harm can be done quietly, without blood or spectacle. As we move forward, the next story will take us from ideas to rituals, from theories to collective behavior. Because when belief becomes shared, it often turns physical. And sometimes entire communities move together in ways no one can fully explain, not because they planned to, but because everyone else was doing it. Story 9. When rituals became stranger than reason. Human beings have always created rituals. They bring structure to chaos, meaning to uncertainty, and comfort to fear. Rituals mark transitions, explain the unexplainable, and bind communities together. In many ways, they are one of the most human behaviors imaginable. But when humans had time, too much time, rituals often drifted far from necessity. They became strange and sometimes deeply unsettling. Across history, entire societies embraced rituals that served no practical purpose, offered no measurable benefit, and yet were followed with absolute devotion. These were not fringe beliefs practiced by a few. They were communal actions repeated generation after generation, simply because they were believed to matter, even when no one could explain why. In times of stability, when survival was no longer an immediate threat, people turned inward. They began searching for meaning beyond food, shelter, and safety. The invisible world became more important than the visible one. Spirits, forces, omens, and symbols filled the space left by certainty. Rituals multiplied. Some involved repetitive movements performed at specific times believed to influence weather, harvests, or fate. Others demanded silence, fasting, or isolation. Many required discomfort or pain not as punishment but as participation. The act itself became the goal. People followed rules whose origins were forgotten. They performed gestures whose meanings had faded. Yet stopping felt impossible. To question the ritual was to invite disaster. Because what if it worked? This fear kept rituals alive. Communities convinced themselves that prosperity depended on precise repetition. A wrong step, a missed word, or an altered motion could anger unseen forces. Responsibility for success or failure rested on collective obedience. When things went well, the ritual was praised. When things went poorly, it was blamed for being done incorrectly. Never for being meaningless. This logic made rituals immune to doubt. Over time, rituals grew more elaborate. Simpler actions lost power. More steps were added. More restrictions imposed. Complexity became authority. The harder a ritual was to perform, the more valuable it seemed. Pain entered naturally, standing for hours, holding uncomfortable positions. Enduring cold, heat, or hunger. Pain proved commitment. Endurance proved belief. Those who suffered the most were admired. Children were taught these rituals early. They learned not to ask questions but to follow. Curiosity was discouraged. Precision was rewarded. Tradition became sacred simply because it was old. This early conditioning made rituals feel inevitable. Adults who questioned them felt anxiety rather than skepticism. Fear replaced logic. The ritual was no longer an action, it was identity. What makes these practices so unsettling is how detached they often became from their original purpose. Some rituals began as practical responses to real problems, but as circumstances changed, the rituals remained. They fossilized, and instead of adapting, societies clung to them more tightly. Change felt dangerous. Stability depended on sameness. In some cases, rituals became performative spectacles. Large crowds gathered to participate, movements synchronized, voices chanted, bodies moved as one. The individual dissolved into the group. This collective behavior created powerful emotional effects. Participants felt connected, elevated, and protected. Doubt faded in the presence of shared rhythm. The ritual worked emotionally. That was enough. Even when rituals caused harm, they persisted. People collapsed from exhaustion. Injuries occurred. Deaths happened. These outcomes were not seen as failures. They were sacrifices, meaning absorbed loss. This absorption is one of the most disturbing aspects of ritual behavior. When harm can be reframed as necessary, resistance disappears. Suffering becomes proof rather than warning. Entire communities can move together into danger without noticing. History offers many examples of mass rituals that escalated beyond control. Behaviors spread rapidly, driven by imitation and fear of exclusion. Once participation reached a critical mass, stopping felt impossible. No one wanted to be the first to refuse because refusal meant standing alone. This is where ritual crosses into something darker. It stops being about belief and becomes about conformity. The fear of social isolation outweighs the fear of harm. People do not ask whether the ritual makes sense. They ask whether they belong, and belonging is powerful. Over time, some rituals faded as societies changed. New explanations replaced old fears. Education weakened superstition. But many rituals survived, stripped of meaning but preserved through habit. Even today, humans perform rituals they cannot explain. They follow routines simply because they feel right, because stopping feels wrong. The past reminds us that rituals are not harmless by default. They shape behavior deeply. They override logic. They bind individuals into collective momentum. And when that momentum turns dangerous, it can carry entire societies with it. As we approach the final story, we see all these threads converge: boredom, curiosity, belief, conformity, ritual, danger. Because the strangest trends in history were not always planned, sometimes they simply happened. They spread, and suddenly entire populations were behaving in ways no one fully understood. The final story will show us what happens when this collective energy reaches a breaking point. When human behavior becomes contagious, and when societies lose control not through violence or belief alone, but through something far more unpredictable: the mind. Story 10. When human behavior became contagious, there is a comforting belief that humans act as individuals, that decisions are made consciously, deliberately, and independently. We like to think that even in crowds, we remain ourselves. History quietly dismantles this belief. There have been moments when entire communities moved, reacted, and behaved in ways no single person could fully explain. Not because of orders, not because of belief systems carefully taught over time, but because behavior itself became contagious. When humans had time, stability, and shared anxiety, something strange happened. Behavior spread like a disease. One of the most unsettling examples comes from episodes historians later described as collective madness. Entire towns suddenly began dancing uncontrollably. Men, women, and children moved for hours, sometimes days, without stopping. They collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, and heart failure. No music was required, no celebration planned. It simply started. One person moved, another joined, then another. Soon, dozens followed. The behavior spread faster than explanation. Authorities watched in confusion. Clergy prayed. Physicians debated causes. Nothing stopped it. The participants did not describe joy. They described compulsion, an inability to stop moving, a sense that their bodies were no longer fully under their control. Some begged to be restrained, others resisted restraint violently. When the episode finally ended, it left behind injury, trauma, and death, and yet no single cause could be identified. The phenomenon faded as mysteriously as it began. These were not isolated incidents. Across history, similar outbreaks occurred. Uncontrolled laughter, sudden mass fainting, panic that spread without visible threat. Behaviors jumped from person to person through proximity alone. Fear was not required. Attention was enough. What makes these events so disturbing is their ordinariness. The people involved were not criminals, not cult members, not extremists. They were bakers, farmers, parents, children, normal people. Their lives were not marked by desperation. Many lived in relatively stable communities. But stability does not eliminate stress. It concentrates it. When pressure has no outlet, it leaks. Collective behavior became that outlet. These episodes reveal something fundamental about human psychology. We are deeply responsive to others. We mirror. We imitate. We absorb emotion through observation. This is how empathy forms, but it is also how chaos spreads. In tightly connected communities, emotions circulate quickly. Fear multiplies, excitement escalates, tension builds. When one person breaks pattern, others follow, not because they want to, because their nervous systems respond. When humans had time, they noticed each other more. In close-knit societies without constant distraction, attention was intense. Everyone watched everyone else. This constant awareness made behavior contagious. Once a critical mass was reached, stopping felt impossible. The group momentum overpowered individual will. Those who resisted felt isolated, anxious, and overwhelmed. Joining felt safer. This is the same mechanism behind panic stampedes, mass hysteria, and sudden waves of irrational behavior. The trigger varies, the pattern remains. What history teaches us is that the mind is not sealed inside the skull. It is influenced continuously by others. In certain conditions, this influence becomes overwhelming, and boredom plays a role. When life lacks stimulation, unusual behavior stands out. It draws attention. Attention spreads it. Soon, the behavior becomes the event itself. People stop asking why it started. They focus on participating. Authorities struggled to respond. Punishment failed. Logic failed. Force sometimes worsened the situation. The more attention given, the stronger the spread. Eventually, time itself ended these episodes. Exhaustion, injury, fear. The body imposed limits the mind ignored. Afterward, communities searched for explanations. Supernatural forces, toxins, divine punishment. Rarely did they accept the simplest answer, that humans influence each other more than they realize. These stories are unsettling because they challenge the idea of control. They suggest that under the right conditions, individuality can dissolve, that rational behavior can collapse without warning, and that boredom, stability, and close social connection can create pressure just as powerful as hunger or fear. History does not show us these events to frighten us. It shows them to warn us. Because the conditions that produce these behaviors are not gone. They change form. Today, behavior still spreads rapidly. Not through town squares, but through screens. Emotions jump across networks. Panic travels faster than reason. Trends escalate before reflection catches up. The mechanism is the same, only the medium has changed. The final lesson of this story is perhaps the most uncomfortable of all. Human beings are not as independent as they believe. We are shaped continuously by what we see others do. When enough people move in one direction, standing still feels impossible. This does not make humans weak, it makes them social. But social behavior, when unexamined, can become dangerous. History shows us that some of the strangest trends did not begin with belief, curiosity, or even boredom alone. They began with observation. One person watched another, and something spread. As we close this chapter, we are left with a question that history cannot answer for us. If you had lived then, surrounded by the same people, the same pressures, the same stability, and the same boredom, would you have resisted? Or would you have moved with the crowd, convinced that nothing strange was happening at all? Because the most dangerous trends in history were not the ones people feared. They were the ones that felt normal. As this journey comes to an end, it may feel tempting to distance yourself from everything you have just heard, to reassure yourself that these strange trends belong to a distant past, that they were products of ignorance, superstition, or a lack of knowledge that modern humanity has outgrown. History rarely allows us that comfort. The people behind these stories were not irrational. They were not insane. They were not fundamentally different from us. They were ordinary individuals living in societies that felt stable, familiar, and normal to them. They woke up, worked, socialized, raised children, and followed routines just as we do now. And when they had time, they filled it. Not always with wisdom, not always with kindness, but with curiosity, imitation, and the powerful desire to belong. These trends did not spread because people were cruel. They spread because people were human, because boredom creates restlessness, because curiosity seeks stimulation, because social pressure is often stronger than logic, and because once a behavior becomes normal, it stops feeling dangerous. This is perhaps the most unsettling lesson history offers. Normality is fragile. What feels absurd to us today once felt ordinary. What feels unthinkable now once felt acceptable. And what we defend as harmless in our own time may one day be studied with disbelief. History does not progress in a straight line toward enlightenment. It bends, it loops, it repeats patterns under different names and forms. When circumstances align, old impulses resurface. When survival becomes easier, meaning becomes harder to find. And when meaning is missing, humans invent it. Sometimes in art, sometimes in science, sometimes in beauty, and sometimes in trends that push the boundaries of safety, empathy, and reason. The stories you have heard are not warnings about the past alone. They are mirrors held up to the present. They ask us to consider how easily we adapt to collective behavior, how quickly we justify what everyone around us accepts, how rarely we stop to ask why something feels normal. Because normalization is powerful. It dulls discomfort. It silences doubt. It transforms risk into routine. And once something is routine, resistance feels unnecessary. History teaches us that cruelty does not always arrive loudly. It often arrives quietly, wrapped in habit, tradition, or entertainment. It grows through repetition, not shock. It survives through participation, not intention. No single person created these trends. No single person controlled them. They emerged from shared attention and spread through imitation. That is why they were so difficult to stop, and that is why they matter now. We live in a time where trends move faster than ever, where behavior spreads instantly, where attention is currency and participation is rewarded, where boredom still exists even when surrounded by constant stimulation. The conditions have changed, the mechanisms have not. Human beings still chase novelty, still seek belonging, still mistake visibility for value, still confuse participation with meaning. History does not judge us for this. It explains us. It shows us that the line between harmless curiosity and harmful trend is thinner than we would like to believe. That the difference between tradition and cruelty is often only perspective. that social pressure can turn discomfort into pride and danger into entertainment. Understanding this does not require shame. It requires awareness. Awareness that progress is not automatic, that compassion must be protected intentionally, that critical thinking is not natural but practiced, and that stepping away from the crowd, even briefly, takes courage. The people of the past did not think they were doing anything strange. They thought they were participating in life as it was meant to be lived. They trusted their communities. They followed examples. They assumed that if something was widespread, it must be reasonable. That assumption has always been dangerous. As you leave these stories behind, do not carry only the discomfort. Carry the question they leave behind. When something becomes popular, do you ask why? When behavior spreads, do you pause before joining? When everyone seems to agree, do you examine the cost? History suggests that the most unsettling trends are not born from malice but from unexamined acceptance. The past does not exist to frighten us. It exists to remind us that humanity's greatest strength, our ability to adapt, is also our greatest vulnerability. We adapt to environments, we adapt to norms, we adapt to each other. And without reflection, we can adapt to almost anything, even to things that should never feel normal. This is why history matters. Not as a collection of dates and events, but as a record of human behavior under different conditions, a reminder that progress is fragile, that values must be defended, that empathy requires effort, because the moment we stop questioning what feels normal is the moment history begins to repeat itself. And it always does. Not exactly, but closely enough. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying curious, and thank you for turning these strange pages of history with us. The past is never as distant as it seems.